as this notion, right, of the law itself having a life beyond the courtroom, a life of assembling and disassembling the ways in which Black and Black queer people live and die, right? So we're talking about the ordering and disordering of Black and Black queer life. And when we say Black queer life, we're also inclusive, right, of transgender life as well. So with that, I will start off with our first introduction. And the way this is set up is I'm going to go through introductions. And then we'll come back around. I'm going to ask folks in your mind for 5 to 7 minutes, what is the state of Black life or Black and Black queer life in the law? And they might provide a greater introduction to themselves. So first off, we have my fave, my sister, my bresta, and my agenda, gender-free bad bitch, Hunter Shackleford, who is a multidisciplinary artist, independent scholar, and a bioethicist. Shout out to them. They also coined or at least popularized the term death work that we're working with as we think through this conversation. Next up, we have TJ, who is a multimedia artist, a philosopher, and aspiring death doula. We'll get into that a little bit more, but shout out to them as well. They do a lot of work in the community and have been someone that I have really admired and taken advice and leadership from insofar as how do we translate some of these really interesting critical theories to the communities that are not necessarily in academia and its ivory towers, and even problematizing the notion of translation, right? Are you really translating to folks that are outside of academia? Or, right, are you learning to speak a language that has not been taught to you because you're within academia, right? So is a translation about you or is it about community? So we try to wake that up. And then, of course, we have Daniel. I always mispronounce your last name, child. McCrary. Get me right if it's not right. But they are an LICSW, honey. They're a licensed girl, a psychotherapist, and they work in LGBTQ advocacy. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Demar Lewis, who is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice. So I'm going to work backwards and allow the girls, actually, this is not backwards. I'm going to work from the way I started and allow the girls to give themselves a little bit more of an introduction. But again, to really ask the kind of preordinate question, Hunter Shackleford, what is the state of Black life in the law where you're located? And if there's more you want to say about you, girl, who are you? Tell the people.
I don't know why I thought I wasn't going first. I just felt in my spirit. I was like, I'm not going first. But I love this so much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank y'all for being here. And thanks to these amazing panelists. So yeah, great question. Um, I think my positionality wouldn't necessarily be geolocational, but I will say, like, for my purview and in my relationships, but also what I think is relevant worldwide to Black people is that the state of Black life lives beneath the quotidian of Black death. And that, as Sadia Hartman names, care would be possibly the antidote to violence, but I actually believe that care is a form of death. And I think in relationality to Black life and the state of Black life, I think that in that analysis, that it would be pertinent for us to be clear about how much care requires in order to intervene the never-ending death that impacts Black people worldwide. And so as we address anti-Blackness, and when I think about how death work comes online for me and how, like, my original entry point was around 2019, when I realized that it was a terminology that really fit a particular circumstance that I was in when I was trying to address an abuser, and trying to navigate in community what that would look like, especially being an organizer, being a part of a praxis that was larger than me, a part of radical thought, and being a part of a Black liberatory space, and in relationship with people who are also aligned with that politic. It was very difficult to address how intercommunal harm happens and how there were continuous repetitive things that we've seen historically, where history has really given us evidence about, like, across movements and across organizing, but also just across community building, how we see a lot of departures around people's willingness to relinquish gender, anti-Black gender, and people's unwillingness to relinquish, wanting to reconstitute what could be a potential Black patriarchy, and how that often fuels a lot of the tensions that we see around how we can actually build a world where Black life is actually possible, because often we're organizing in responsiveness to Black death. So when I think about who's killing us, which I called the Death Work Manifesto in 2019, it was specifically after that situation where I was experiencing a particular type of harm, but I wanted to avoid using the state as an intervention around that situation. And that opened up a door for me around a particular type of sacrifice that I believe victims across identity and experience go through in a world that is like embedded with anti-Black rape culture and embedded with like in a world where victimhood is not taken serious, especially around sexual violence and how gender violence comes online. But in that capacity, I also think that when I think about Megan Thee Stallion and how over the course of her career, she's actually shared with us twice, like even before the situation with Tory Lanez, that she also was in a position where she sacrificed her own safety and her own truth telling in order to avoid how state sanctioned violence could actually be wielded against her Black cis het man partner at the time, right? And so this also applies to her situation with Tory Lanez. And when we think about Marissa Alexander, who also shot a warning shot at her husband while she was pregnant as he was trying to attack her, she was then prosecuted for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And in that she was facing 20 years, right? And this is all while she's pregnant. So, and then we can even look at the Brittany Watts situation where like even in defense of your own body against what your body is doing and how a miscarriage comes along, being prosecuted for defame, or was it abusing a corpse when she had the miscarriage at home after leaving the hospital. So even in all the capacities of how we see Black life, right, not just in like how our interpersonal relationships come online, but even how we think about reproductive capacities and how these things are punished by the state. We're often in a conversation about what death work could really look like as an intervention to only landing at care, and often as an opportunity to kind of name the never-ending agony that exists when you're trying to work against a particular allegiance to anti-Blackness that comes on when you're not even dealing with the state, but how the state is already intimate with us, even in our interpersonal relationships, and those who are allegiant to the state will actually drain you of that particular care, will drain you of your time and your energy under the premise that you owe them this, right? And you're trying to save them while you're also trying to save yourself. And that really is death work. That means that the care that we are extending even to people who have power over and against us, positionality, socially, and also have an allegiance to anti-Blackness, get to benefit from the praxis and the line that we hold, the integrity that we often are curating from our own flesh, from our own sacrifice. And I think that that happens at these margins, especially around Blackness, gender and queerness, sexuality, and altogether those who are allegiant to wanting to move towards a Black radical thought. So in my purview, when I think about the state of Black life and thinking about how the law comes online in this conversation, I often think about the interventions that we would be creating like when we're dealing with this death work, when we're dealing with this never-ending sacrifice in order to maintain the community that needs to exist once we get to liberation, right? Like, because we still need our people if revolution is possible, under the premise of trying to preserve or at least attain Black life. And I think about how does the law and also how does the state and how do state actors and ops in our community actually prevent us from shooting proactively at people who have already made their decision to be against us, right? Instead of extending a particular level of political care to folks who have actually not made it clear to us where they stand, and can also serve a very particular type of threat to our well-being. Can we shoot first? Can we shoot back? And what will it mean to actually try to intervene the never-ending demand for death work in order to kind of curate a world that would actually be oppositional to the world that we live in that is defined by Black death in order to pursue Black life?
No, that's a beautiful and also in many ways a humbling kind of articulation of the state of where we are now. I think very deeply about what you talked about, particularly with the sister, right, who gets charged and arrested for abuse of a corpse. Like, what does it mean that the fetal corpse, right, has more rights than the living Black woman? That if she had not had this child, had not birthed this fetus in this particular type of way, she could be dead. Right. So what does it mean that you're worth more dead than alive? And we can think about this also in terms of like the slave ship, right? Christina Sharp talks about us living in the wake and also being in the hold of the ship. But in that moment, we're also talking about the ways in which like Black reproductive power is actually more powerful than Black life. And where Black life gets power, it's through the reproductive mechanism of racialized anti-Black capitalisms, right? Racial capitalism. So that's something that we really kind of have to sit with. Like, what does it mean that you're better off dead? Right. And we can think about insurance companies, right, and how they were birthed through many times of the slave canal, the Atlantic slave trade, where they get their value through the notion that Black people might die. Like Black property might cease to exist, and you now need to find a way to like get your money back. So that's something we really kind of have to sit with. And again, even when we think about other Black women that have gone through some of these things, like what does it mean to kind of stand your ground if you're seen as living fleshy property in the kind of modality that Hortense Spillers has us kind of think of like the ungendering, right, and the agrammatical nature of Black women and Black people in gender. So with that, let me switch it over and flip it over. I see you, Adrian. Thank you for bringing up City Bank in Haiti also in the chat. There's a lot going on with diverse reparations in Haiti and France. We can wake that up in the Q&A later. But TJ, let me switch it over to you. What is the state of Black life in the law?
Period. I just want to say Hunter just gave a really great summation, and like not everybody we could go now, but like that was just chef kiss. Also Hunter and I are so aligned in our like relationship to death, to talking about autonomy, like body autonomy, especially as it relates to content warning, like suicide. And so I think when I am thinking about Black life, I'm automatically thinking about Black death, because not all Black people are allowed to be living beings, and questioning what does it mean to be alive versus what does it mean to exist. I do love a definition, so I was in prepping for this conversation really thinking about how does the law define life? How do we define life? But ultimately, even in the instances that Hunter was talking about, it's all these tools around how we define life and how society defines death are about how to yield tools against Black people, right? If I can criminalize you for, having a miscarriage, then I'm going to do that. I'm going to say that this little Black child, this Black fetus, is more important than you living Black woman, because I can yield this to harm you, and I can yield this to enslave you, right? And so when I'm thinking about that, I'm like, okay, yes, just when I am thinking about Black life, I really think about body autonomy. I think about the ways in which we define ourselves. And I think very, very deeply about folks who do not want to be alive. And what that means for them, what it means to be defined as dead. I'm talking for my larger body people who are named morbidly obese, right? What does it mean when some of the terms that are even used for Black people is literally death, and people's relationship with that. So I just have been thinking deeply, and I think my politic comes from truly thinking about, I don't want to say luxury, but that's the word that I have right now, but just how sometimes living really is a privilege, and people will think, oh, because you're existing, you all have the same access to life, and that's just simply not true. And so I'm just thinking about Black folks who do want to, as folks who don't want to be here, and also folks who do want to be here. Lastly, I'll say on that, the thing that makes it a ribbon for me is that like many folks who don't want to live, it's not that they actually don't want to live, is that they don't want to live under these circumstances. And so I find that it's this really hard, like cyclical loop, or, Joy James really eats it up as well. And talking about the captive maternal, this parasitic relationship we have with the world as Black folks, to live, to keep everybody else alive. And so that's one end. And of course, I think about Black celebration. I do try to balance it out, not all the negative cloud, while I love to talk about the dark things and some horror and all the scary places people don't want to visit. I do think that it's also an opportunity to say, well, I'm here, I exist, I'm gonna be queer, I'm gonna live out loud, I'm gonna, bleach my hair as many colors as I want to, and pierce my body how I want to, and practice body autonomy in all the ways that are accessible to me. Because I do think that a lot of Black life is just fighting for an identity outside of white supremacy.
shout out to the old hip hop heads in all their problematic ways, right? Tupac said, like, why am I fighting to live if I'm just living to die? Right? Why am I dying to live if there's nothing in sight? Right. So let's get into that. But also at the same time, and I want you to wake this up, TJ, when we come back to later in the broader discussion, but the difference between living and being, right? Because you hinted on that a little bit. But you also talked about the inaccessibility to life for people that are marked as fat and or dark skinned, right? And the both and hits different, right?
And don't be ugly now, okay? Because
Mm,
then we got to get into desirability. But yes, all of those.
yes. Right, because desirability is not just a desirability, and like part of it is about desirability of wanting to seize your body and do things to you. Come on, plantation politics. But it's also the desirability to have you exist. Right? In the kind of allowance for you to take up physical space, psychic space, economic and political space. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but I wanted to put a pin in that because I really do want to come back to that and have you wake up that difference between living and being. And as Maya Angelou really says, the difference between like surviving, right, living and thriving, which are very three different kind of modalities. But with that, let us come over to the good doctor, our good therapist, Mr. Daniel. What's going on? What's the state of Black life and the law, beloved?
Um, Mine is going to be a little bit more of a stream of consciousness, and depending on time, just jump in and stop me. I'm coming at Black life and the law through the lens of mental health. So I'm thinking about Lose Your Mother and Saidiya Hartman. I'm specifically thinking about the afterlife of slavery as it relates to limited access to health and education, and even probably more specifically, the limited access to health education. I'm thinking about the politics of the plantation and slaves who had a desire to escape being labeled with psychiatric disorders and how that maps over how Black people are labeled in the present day. I'm thinking about Anthony Paul Farley and denial as pleasure as it relates to the afterlife of slavery, in the sense that Black people are denied so much as it relates to healthcare, mental health care, and how that is a pleasure for the state because our suffering, you know, improves their ability to experience pleasure. I'm thinking about the mental health crisis in the LGBTQ plus community that is especially rocking the Black community. I'm thinking about the politics of trauma and the fact that racial trauma is not listed in the diagnostic and statistical manual. And so that's another thing that politically and legally can block Black people from accessing healthcare. I'm thinking of the crisis of depression and anxiety as it relates to ongoing loneliness in the Black queer community, because it can be so hard for people to connect with each other. It can be unsafe, depending on where people live. You talk about geography. I'm thinking of demonic grounds. Where you are is going to impact if there are even other people around who view you as valuable enough to want to convene with you. I'm thinking about loneliness as it especially relates to older Black queer people who are sometimes made invisible due to their Blackness, their queerness, and their age in and out of the community. And then as it relates to law and policy more broadly, I'm thinking about access to care in general. But then for Black queer people, access to care that's going to affirm them as Black queer and Black queer. I talk to people all the time who have access to care, but not really, because of the things that their therapists and psychiatrists and other providers are daring to say to them. I'm also thinking about access to health insurance, which is directly related to access to work. And I'm thinking about the different states in the union where we still have at-will laws, where you're not going to be fired on paper for being Black queer, but they're going to see that, and then they're going to start building a case against you in some other way. And I'm thinking about all of the attacks on, LGBTQ plus affirming care that we see every day. We've got lots of different organizations that are tracking those laws. And that's a form of symbolic violence, where you're seeing, okay, I'm not welcome in a hospital, so let me just stop going to hospitals. And I'm also thinking about housing justice, which is directly related to mental health care and a life, because what we know from the literature is that poverty leads to evictions, and evictions are directly related to suicidal ideations. And we don't really ever talk about that publicly. But there's a lot of good information on that. And I think we know we don't talk about that because the state knows, well, it's Black people who are being evicted. So them having suicidal ideations is not super important to us. So obviously we'll dig more later, but that is what I'm thinking about tonight.
Yeah, I mean, like what you're saying, and I mean, you shouted out Sadia Hartman, and I put the quote that you were really talking about in the chat. But what you're talking about also beyond like, the kind of state of Black life and the law is like access to living,
Mhm.
access to existence, and the
But
kind of structural, go ahead.
if we can't name, I'm thinking a lot about spillers and misnaming and naming. If we can't even name what we're going through, how can we ever think to begin to truly organize to deal with it and get through it? And I'm so passionate about people situating racial trauma and sexual trespass because there's so much shame and self-blame that goes along as a post-traumatic stress symptom. And so when people don't have the language to know that what they have gone through is literally a trauma, they spend so much of their life, their Black life, blaming themselves. And the state is always going to support Black people
Yeah.
in blaming themselves.
Well, I mean, it's, I think I always go back and forth. I always misquote this, but it's either Audre Lorde or, Bell Hooks. So I believe it's Audre. No, actually, both of them are wrong. It's Zora Neale Hurston. And she says, if you don't talk, if you're silent about your pain, right, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. Right. And I think that's something important to kind of think about, particularly for the Black community, about the power of witnessing and bearing witness to other people's experience, but also bearing testimony to your own experience. But I wanted to say before we moved on to Demar, Dr. Lewis over here, what you were talking about, again, is this kind of notion of the access to the notion of being alive. Right? That bridge between fleshy property, right, that Spillers gives us, right, and a living body. And how do we sit with that? And in particular, right, the idea that like Black people can't feel pain, so why would you get therapy? Right? And if you get therapy, are you really a Black person? Right. And not only that, now does this therapy become evidence of your violence, hypermasculinity, hypersexuality, delusion, and criminal predilections, when in fact we know that so much of criminal law, right, is built upon the notion of how do you control the newly freed, formerly enslaved Black folk. Uh, so with that, we're gonna go over here to our one and only Dr. Demar Lewis the fourth, honey, who's an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice, and as they reminded the people earlier on, trained in the good old Black studies ways. What is the state of Black life and the law, Dr. Lewis?
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for having us, and to my fellow panelists, and to everyone for coming tonight. Well, I mean, they said a lot of what I'm going to say, but I think I've been wrestling with this question for as long as I can remember in my adult life. And so, in prepping for today, I guess the way I wanted to respond initially to the question is that I think it depends on which of the many Black communities you ask. Right? And let's start with Black people living in the United States. Are we talking about this, thinking about this question in light of the Black middle or upper middle class? Are we thinking about this in terms of Black working class folks, people who were formerly incarcerated, members of the LGBTQIA community, people who are disabled, aging, chronically ill, as some of my panelists have already uplifted? And the reason why I name that is because Black communities are not monolithic, even if we are members of the same demographic. But I'd argue that there are certain circumstances that Black people in the United States are cumulatively being exposed to that are examples of what social psychiatrist Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove might refer to as a calamity or unfortunate circumstances that have the capacity to change. And here I'm thinking of COVID-19 and responses to it. I'm thinking of the lack of availability and affordability of housing today. I'm thinking of the lack of opportunities to maintain stable employment that pays livable wages. I'm thinking about insufficient access to healthy foods that have nutritional value, schooling systems that are unable to promote young people either into higher education or employment sectors that are paying livable wages. Or as Daniel was just mentioning, thinking about insufficient access to culturally competent healthcare or mental health services, right? But what I'm also thinking, and also violence. And when I say violence, I'm not only thinking of violence in the forms of physical harm or sexual assault, but I'm thinking alongside Dr. Amaka Okeketru, who's thinking of also resource deprivation and imposition of economic precarity, thinking about undesired exposure to state violence, as some of my fellow panelists have uplifted, premature death from natural causes, but largely those that have been structured to disproportionately target minoritized and resource-deprived populations. And for me, or at least in the work I do, I think about the work of socio-legal scholar Monica Bell, who says that, quote, violence in all its forms threatens safety, end quote. Thus, it's clear that one component of how the status of Black people are doing right now in the United States is that not all Black people are safe. And not all Black people have basic access to the resources they need to live happy, healthy, productive lives. And, in my work, I try to examine how historical and contemporary notions of safety influence the ways that Black people organize their lives. And for me, I'm particularly interested in understanding how Black Americans have and do imagine possibilities for citizenship, safety, opportunity, and expression, where, as Mariam Kaba says, quote, Black communities have everything they need, quote, in a nation that continues to not deliver on all of its promises of democracy. And this has led me in a bunch of different directions. On one hand, to examine how the politics of abolition have shaped the anti-lynching activism of Ida B. Wells, Monroe Work, Tuskegee Institute. It's guided me to want to understand the long arc of defund in American politics and American history, and to study how the praxis of abolition and deinstitutionalization have shaped the way media outlets represent issues in American politics in the 21st century. And in a more contemporary vein of my work, I'm also thinking about how Black people and Black Americans in particular in the 21st century are reimagining the future of community safety in the United States and evaluating the defund the police mandate and its implications for policing. And there's numerous insights that this collective body of work has produced, which I believe are relevant for the forum we're here for today. But I'm going to reduce these to three. And first, as my panelists have said, and as you started in your introduction, Dr. Wilson, the conditions and forces shaping Black life in America today are largely not legible to the law. Even in situations where different actors are operating to deny different parts of the Black community access to the resources they need to live happy, healthy, productive lives that can be intervened against, the law itself and those who enforce the law don't always and often don't act in the best interest of Black people whose interests are not otherwise beneficial to those in power. And here I'm thinking about, this is the catch-22 Derek Bell calls interest convergence. Second, anti-Blackness, or when I think of anti-Blackness, I think about the ongoing denial of investment in Black life that is central to civil society's maintenance and technological advancement. And anti-Blackness has always been present in the United States since its inception and will not disappear overnight or in the near future because it's deeply entrenched within systems and structures of capitalism, which are global, as some of our attendees have also pointed out as well. Yet, even in spite of anti-Blackness, I see and I find that Black people have and still do find space to celebrate life, experience joy, and imagine that it's possible to build a world where we're free from the legible and illegible sources of harm that otherwise might lead to our demise. And third, in thinking about what we're here to talk about today, I know somewhere in the mentioning of the program is the word abolition. And so I wanted to evoke abolition specifically and to say that abolition, as I understand it, is a praxis of perpetual process improvement. It's not just about tearing things down, but also identifying how to positively invest resources, reduce harm, and build an infrastructure for manifesting safe and healthy communities, because these things are inextricably linked. And although there are many people that do not self-identify as abolitionists or openly subscribe to the principles of abolition, they still do recognize that there is room to improve the capacity of democratic institutions and state actors to deliver on promises of democracy. And to that end, maybe the law can be a vehicle to help institutionalize certain types of transformative change, but the law on its own will not save us. The law and those who enforce it will not proactively move with all deliberate speed, in the famous words of Charles Ogletree. That power has always rested with us. And thus, those of us who are called to do this work must be deliberate in our efforts to tend to the collectives or causes we're called to serve. We must be deliberate in trying new strategies to eliminate all the forms of violence that threaten our safety. And we must be tireless in those efforts to realize or to live these new realities into existence day by day. But I personally don't think that we should be overly expectant that the law or lawmakers will be set into motion in our lifetimes. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't still do the work, because there's a lot to live for, because there are Black people in the future.
All right, so thank you for that, Dr. Lewis. I mean, there's just so much I've written down in my little, iPhone, Apple Notes. Shout out to that type of racial capitalism too that I'm inured to, and seduced by. Come on, Apple, and your copper mining in Africa and all the things. But that aside, I've taken down so many notes about where to start and what first question to ask. But one of the things that has been, sticking on my heart and on also my mind intellectually is trying to figure out, what the hell do Black people do with the law? Right? Because if we think about the law very seriously and we get down to its most basic assumptions and privileges, right? We have to think about the law itself as the public logic of power. Right? And the mechanism for ensuring safety. And as Hunter and TJ and Daniel and I have talked about at length, right? And you and I have talked about a little bit in DC recently, the notion of safety requires violence. And it requires someone to be able to be violated. Right? And the difference between law and individual opinion or emotional overwhelming, and you just had a fit of rage, is that there has been a collective that has agreed that this type of violence is not only, I want to say the word necessary, because necessary is weird, because oftentimes violence by the law is gratuitous, but that this type of violence is called for, and it makes sense, and we need it for our sense of community. And so, the first part of the fly that we kind of talked about, the first part of the fly that our advertisement is like this notion of care work. So, my question is, how do law and care cohere? And not in the kind of basic Googleable version, right? But I'm thinking about in real day-to-day shit. When a Black queer or trans person, a Black trans woman, is being abused by her partner, and all she can do in that moment is to call the police, knowing very well that the data show that the people most likely to be killed by the police, most likely to be sexually violated by the police, and oftentimes most likely to be ignored by the police. So how do you get ignored, sexually violated, and killed in the same sentence, right? Are all Black trans women and Black non-binary people. So how do we situate care and law and lawfulness, right, in the kind of same conversation, the same sentence? And how do we undo this mess of it all? Because at the end of the day, if you're encountering violence, and this is the biggest critique against abolition, right? That oh, when something terrible happens to you, who are you going to call? But we also know that most Black people are not calling. Most Black people are not, even with their last breath, calling the police. What do y'all say to that? How do we work through that? Is this just a misnomer? Are there ways that your communities or you and your own expertise or your way of living and being as a Black person or a Black queer person or a Black man or as a Black expert in a particular type of area have had to maneuver beyond this type of binary or past it or through it or underneath it? Let me start with you, TJ. What do you say?
Yeah. I feel like when I am thinking about that question and all the things you just said, one thing that really stood out to me was safety. And I do think that there is no place that is safe for Black people. And I know that that's hard for a lot of people to hear or realize, but safety is an illusion. If you follow me on any of my socials, I'm saying it all the time. And I think that it should red flag you anything, institution, theory that's like, we can build a safe place here under anti-Blackness. Hello? And so when I think about law, I do think about that it is a pillar of white supremacy, that it is a pillar of colonization, it is a pillar of anti-Blackness, it is used to perpetuate all of these systems of harm and violence, and it is the thing that legitimates it. And the thing about law is that it's at the intersection of like morality and religion, where we're told to pretend that it is not. But much that we see around law is rooted in religious backgrounds. So even identifying like the criminalization of suicide is because of, religious moral theories. And so I think when we are considering what do Black people do with the law, it's like there's no cookie cutter way to engage with the law because you don't know. You will always be able to use the law to enact anti-Blackness. And if you're a Black person calling the police on another Black person, you just got to cross your fingers and hope that, they get the person you want them to and not you. I just think it's complicated and not complicated. I do think that it is complex. I feel like the word complicated for me relaxes a lot of people. It's like, this is too much to be able to handle or deal with. But I do think, especially with the brilliant brains we have on this panel, can think through
Let's
this.
also
But
talk
that's
about
the thing that comes forward to me is like really thinking about safety and how it's not real.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, fam, but also let's talk about that word, right? How the word complex or the word complicated has become this vehicle, particularly for non-Black people, non-Black people of color, but also white folks, right? To do this type of work where it's like, oh, well, it's a really complicated situation, and it becomes evasion, right? It becomes a way to say that your life is inconvenient. And I'm not going to get into it because I'm going to feign like it's too much for the mind or the spirit to handle. When in reality, right, we all know the solutions. We all know the answers.
Like when white
Well's
people
been
were
telling
like,
us for 100 years.
remember when white people were like, oh my God, this Black Lives Matter stuff I have social justice fatigue. I really need to take a break. I'm overwhelmed. This whole fighting for everybody's life, this is way too much. I need a break. I need a sabbatical from social justice. Like, yes. Like, oh, okay.
Right, it's social justice fatigue, but imagine being Black. Like, because I have explanation fatigue. But so like let me get back into the moderator role and just say like people just jump in, right? Like we're gonna do free flow. If you have any comments or responses to what TJ was talking about, or even this kind of notion of like, what the hell is care work? Is care work a real thing? Or is care work, as Hunter has kind of given us over the last month or so, is care work death work? Right? And what do we do with the tension that what does it mean to be a Black person? We can even go back right to the Atlantic slave trade and the whole of the ship, as Christina likes to bring us back to, and think about the notion that like to provide care is necessarily to treat oneself with death, right? And is that a negative thing? right? Is this something that is honorable? Is it dignified? Is it neutral, right? Or is this a particular type of politic that says, wait a minute, right? My investment in the survival of someone else does something different to me that isn't actually about an accumulation of good feelings or ethics or values. It just is, and I give a damn, right? Like, so how do we situate the tensions between care work and death work, if there is a tension, if they're not the same thing? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And also, again, thinking about the law or even pushing aside the law, how the hell does a law work as a type of a tool to mediate or something that is predetermining, right? Our own collective death project. So anyone can jump in. Y'all grown.
I want to actually pick up on a couple of things TJ said, but I also want to uplift something that one of our participants, Elle, said in the comments, where they say safety is a white fantasy that points to certain bodies as threats to their safety, which they then call to be eradicated in order to be safe. And why I wanted to uplift that is because I really think it's essential when we talk about safety that we have to differentiate security from safety. Security from safety. The reason being, in the world we live in now, security logics, those of like protecting nation states, have been infused and basically corrupted to some extent to be used as how we think about safety, right? So we use these nationalistic and xenophobic lenses to think about those who are not us or those who are seen to be citizens or not. What then, therefore, are the rights that should be provided? Because there is no constitutional right to safety, right? And in the world we live in, where white supremacy reigns, but that all these logics are interacting with one another and other systems of domination, right? Anybody can do the work of the state to target those who are not deemed worthy to be here, whether that be us or whether that be others, right? But I think it's important to differentiate what safety is, like what security is, from what safety is. Because I think safety has to be something, regardless of how it's been created, the possibility of us being safe is predicated on so much more than just our protection from crime and violence. It does need that, right? But even as many of us said in our opening remarks, we have to think about how do we promote access to the resources people need, not just to live, but also to be. And to some degree, maybe the law can play a role in helping to facilitate that access. But I think other institutions, other organizations, other like collectives can provide and mobilize resources too. I think it's I think the law can't be, we can't go by a trickle-down economics model, because the law itself is not going to ensure that access. It's not going to ensure that we live.
Right, and so I want to point out two things before I let Daniel and Hunter respond to this. I really want to hear Hunter's exploration, right, of death work, and that's why it's in the title of the group. But I also want to hear Daniel kind of think about, you know, from their own professional expertise, like this notion of safety and problematize it, right? We think that we are entitled to safety. And what does the feeling of safety mean, right? Like both psychosomatically, but also psychosocially, right? Like, what do we mean by safety? What's going on in the brain? What's happening in our bodies emotionally? How we're acculturated to this thing. But like, finally, before I do all of that and let you two go at this, I also want to just note and kind of underscore, right, how safety, as Demar was saying, right, becomes a type of precursor or accoutrement to the category of the citizen, right? It's something that the citizen deserves, right? And the citizen in American history is the human. And that human is a white land-owning male, right, in the 1800s. So we have to kind of wake that up too. Who are they want to be safe from? Women, indigenous people, the Black free people and the enslaved, Asian Americans or Asian people immigrating to the States. That was safety was about a hoarding of resources, right? And so I think we also have to wake up what we mean by safety. It's about the invasion of the category of the privileged citizen and all the accoutrements and the power to oppress that comes with that. But now we made it a colloquial term. So let me turn to Daniel and Hunter. I don't know who wants to go first. You don't have to respond to my prompts. You can wake it up in whatever way you want. But I just wanted to bring you both into the conversation.
Okay. I was like, I didn't know if we were playing tag, and I was like, okay, I'm it. Um, okay. I'm so happy I got to laugh. I really need to get that out. But no, I love conversations moving. So I want to say to the piece around safety, I disagree with bell hooks. That's my person. I love bell hooks. I am a Hooksian, but I disagree with bell hooks on so much, and that's what makes it even more intriguing to like really appreciate her as a scholar and an artist and a thinker. But when she talks about love and there being no place of safety, I like the practice of love and there being no place of safety. I think about also one of her talks where she was talking about even around brave spaces and actually like engaging in spaces where there's enough of like there's like enough mitigation around risk so that you can also like embrace new experiences, new information, and also hold on to like your boundaries and the things that you need. So I feel like in that, like I feel like when we talk about safety, it goes very quickly to a place of we need to like it becomes a very rigid binary of how we maintain that safety, where it's like abuser, victim, and that's actually the narrative that we apply to everything. And someone in the chat was saying about safety, indicating that there being a villain present, which I think is also really fascinating because I think it's a great point, because even things that cannot be seen, right, but maybe triggers are still things that like would be considered to be villainous, right, like around your own safety. Yet most of the time people would assume that villains have a body, and that there's a person that you can actually like apprehend or intervene. And I think that that becomes like a very complicated way of how we intervene safety, because it often becomes about the antagonism, the thing that we're going to stop. But there is no ultimate safety or ultimate safe place. And it doesn't mean that we can't always achieve or try to strive for what feels affirming and safe for us, but that it's always like shaky, it's always uncertain, because life is, right? And I think that it gets really difficult in movements to land at that place instead of it staying in rigidity, because we're always moving in the antithesis to the violence that we're constantly going up against, where it's like we have to have the thing now and it needs to be perfect and it needs to be aligned and concrete, and it just won't be that, because even in freedom will still be a question of safety, not because we didn't have the community rules, not because we didn't commit to the thing, not because we let the wrong person in and we didn't excommunicate them the first time that they fucked up, but because safety is constantly a precarious reality, and it also changes and it also has different definitions. So yeah, holding that tension. And then I did want to say to the care work and death work piece. So, and then the law, when you ask the question about the law and care, so I do think that the law intervenes care, but I also feel like the intervention that you named, right, like around calling the police, while most of us probably don't, there are times that we have to, and there are times that we actually feel compelled to. And I think that I want to hold the tension around the fact that I think that sometimes people do use state intervention because it is the safest option for them. And I don't know how we navigate that, because when we talk about how abolition is constantly under indictment and like is expected to kind of like procure particular types of answers that we just don't have the answers to yet, and that it's always like a constant world building that's always mutating, always moving, because the violence is always moving, right? So we're never going to have all the answers, and we still haven't figured out how to move towards consequence over punishment. Or if we even agree about what to do with abusers, right? Because often we're also coming from a place where we're naming how abusers should be dealt with from a position of maybe what we would do in our own personal victimhood with our personal abuser. But if a victim decides to do something different, would we also affirm that for them? If it's something that we wouldn't do, would we be willing to hear that victims actually have different interpretations of the consequences that they also want for their abusers? And it may not end up with a bullet, right? So it's like, it may end up with a handshake. We got to accept a lot of things. So we got to broaden that about what we believe care intervention can look like. But I do want to say that I do think care work is death work. But I think that in so many ways, we're trying to mitigate, like, I believe in my spirit that, like, that the way that we're trying to support Black community in a world that is trying to kill us, right? If we can't end the world, if we can't end anti-Blackness, then it means that I feel like the focus should shift to how do we lessen the body count about how we show up in anti-Black shit and how we're responding to anti-Blackness. And I think that it can constantly only really be a mitigation practice, because I do think that anti-Blackness would never end. Even if the world ended, we would still be holding on to these memories. We would still be trying to process that trauma. And if generational trauma is like inherited, then that means that also too our bodies remember, like our lineages will remember, the land will remember. So these things are constantly like in question of, could anti-Blackness ever have an end? Histories don't end. Archives don't end, despite if a book is burned. And so I think that with that, it means that then we have to shift the conversation to, what does it mean to understand that care does require a particular type of sacrifice of yourself, but also of like what you believe is possible, because it may not end in this kind of end all be all question of we can save everybody. Freedom is not going to come faster than a bullet for a lot of y'all. Sorry. And so, and I think that we got to also hold that, because a lot of people be ops, and it is what the fuck it is. So you might be gone, babes, and I hope the best for you. But also too, like, those interventions may not stop or pause for a particular praxis or a different type of alternative for that arsenal. We should hold the tensions that some of us are not going to make it. Some of us have been stolen from the possibility of making it, when we really actually probably had the pursuit of trying to build a world for everybody. And I think in holding that, I think that care work is often holding that tension, that death is a requirement, not just to keep everybody safe, but also that it requires a sacrifice that kills you, right? And it, in its own way, it's kind of a suicidal task, right? And I don't think everything is revolutionary suicide, but I do believe that in many ways that sacrificial...
Come on.
Period, right? But I believe that sacrificial positionality does beg the question about, can you ever redeem those parts of yourself that you lose in trying to save everybody else and trying to intervene anti-Blackness? And I don't know if the care workers ever get to redeem those parts of their flesh or their story or their time, right? And for the people who get to benefit off of care work, who may not have ever had to extend, and not in an ableist way, but actually people often choose and will watch people clean, watch people labor, watch people move to domesticated positionalities in community to support an ongoing trauma and everyday task work, right? To keep the community going, to make sure everybody's fed, and will never extend themselves to help and never actually value that as labor that has been extended to ensure that their life actually has another day behind it, right? There are people who are going to benefit off of labor that they will never give because they intentionally just won't give it. And I think that we also have to accept that particular type of sacrifice. And then just to land that in that care work and death work being conflated together, I think also because anti-Blackness won't end, there's going to have to be a question of redemption and what we're willing to live with, for lack of better language, as we kind of try to move towards a new future that has to regard the fact that some people who are in direct opposition to Black liberation and who have a direct commitment to killing Black people at the margins, who are also Black, may make it with us to the new world. And we're going to have to figure out a way to kind of process that. And also we have demons too, that we haven't fully exercised from ourselves, from our political bodies. I know my body's still catching up to my politic, and I know everybody else's is too. So I think with that, we have our own mourning to do, and we also have our own killing to do. So yeah.
You know, I love that. And I also just want to kind of underscore what you just kind of said about what you hinted at, rather, the kind of notion that, listen, victims don't be perfect. And sometimes victims are abusers too, and abusers be victims. And what we're talking about is a snapshot in time. right? Who are you today? What if I catch you in 5 years? Or if I catch you 10 years before? Now who are you? And how do we render you, right? Particularly looking at through law. So I think that's something you really kind of have to wake up. And then also the notion, right, like this kind of conflation. I'm going to come to you next, I'm going to bring up my RA Isaac to ask their question after this. But I think it also really behooves us to kind of ask the question of, right, like, what is abuse? What is violence? It is the only abuse and violence when we have an affiliation or a care for the body that it landed on, right? Because that's what law does. I think about Cece McDonald. She ain't go to jail because she did something necessarily wrong. It was just that the body that the violence came from was not authorized to do violence. Right? Like, and also self-defense now gets rerouted as violence because your body is not one that is seen as legally recognizable as one that can engage in a defense of self or a body that is defendable, right? Shout out again to Black women and Black trans women. But Mr. McCrary, come on, our therapist in chief, give it to us. What's going on?
So as people have been speaking, I've been taking, since it is Black Life in the Law, I brought my legal pad. And I'm thinking about all of these binaries that have emerged of care versus policing, complexity versus something that's complicated, security versus safety, safety versus violation. And what I'm thinking about as care work and death work, and I'm thinking of like a psychic death and a psychic obliteration that comes from having to contend, that's my word, to contend with these realities is the work of learning about all of the projections that the white social order has engaged in and the ways in which we as Black people have unknowingly introjected and are living out things that we have no idea that have even been installed in us. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about tonight that we have to learn, and I'm diagnosing the state in a second, not people, is there's an analytic term called the paranoid schizoid position by Melanie Klein. And it's an infantile issue where a baby is transitioning out of feeling connected to, and this is no shade, but when we think through white violence, we have to go back to immature and infantile defense mechanisms to really make sense. That's part of the reason why the world that we live in is so chaotic. So the baby is transitioning out of being one with the nipple to realizing that they are not the same and that at any moment the nipple could murder them. Now, when people miss other developmental milestones, they stay in this position where then they begin to view everything as a threat to safety. And if a lot of white people are in this kind of statehood of the paranoid schizoid position, what does that say for Black life that's always already going to be that threatening piece? And then for white people, they haven't engaged in the care work and the death work of learning things that have been projected into them by their mothers and fathers and the symbolic father. So it becomes so convoluted so quickly because projection and introjection are like that little recycling thing. And then like with what Hunter was talking about, this is happening all across time. So there are projections and introjections that we are dealing with that are from a slave master from 5 generations ago. That's in there. And there's work that can be done to start to explicate that. And so then the thing that I'm thinking about is when you're stuck in that position as someone who dominates the state, and you're stuck in the kind of this persecutory part of projective identification, you need to install those things in the Black person, the Black body. That becomes a form of racist pleasure or racist jouissance, as Sheldon George talks about. And so I think some of the care work is raising awareness about the fact that this is even happening. And just learning to develop a politic of saying, no, this is a projection, and I don't have to introject. I don't have to engage in the psychological defense of identifying with the aggressor in order to try to feel safer. And I think the other beautiful thing about learning about these kinds of things is that once you know, it's easier to catch it a lot of times moving forward. And I'm very passionate about sharing things with Black people that I think are going to make it easier for them to catch something in the moment and realize that's actually not my thing. That is something that is being projected on me, and it's been projected onto me for many years.
Mm-hmm.
Let's-
Look at
oh,
her, look at her notes. Come on now.
uh, I'm thinking about whiteness as property and what people have been saying about safety. We have to kind of let go of the idea of safety because safety is inherently anti-Black. And we have to imagine new terms because we don't own those things. We are the thing that is owned. So we have to begin to imagine something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to begin living otherwise.
Oh, well, that's in the title.
Shout out to
I would do
Sadia.
that anyway. I would do that anyway.
Yes.
All
Well,
right.
okay, let me slide over to TJ really quickly. It is 8:12. We only have 18 minutes left. I don't believe in keeping people past the time they've been paid. We like to be on a timely area. So after TJ, if you have a thought, of course I'm gonna bring up Isaac. I know you're not on camera right now, but you're gonna be on camera, Isaac. I believe in putting my RAs in front of the scholarly girls, in front of the thinker girls. But if you're other people that have questions and want to ask your questions, raise your hand on Zoom. We're gonna Zoom through you and maybe ask maybe 5 questions at once, and then get the reactions from our panelists. I meant to have some more time for Q&A, so blame me, charge it to my heart and not to my head, child. Because I like to have our panelists leave in a timely fashion because Black lives do matter, Black coins matter, Black direct deposits and checks matter, and we don't work for free, So I try to make this a free event for everyone to come to. But anyway, so we're gonna come to you, TJ, and then we will move on to our audience questions.
Period, because I know the people want to ask their questions, and I feel that. I love us discussing oppositional relationships when we're talking about these terms and phrases. And I think about safety, particularly in community organizing work, which is that I can't say nobody because, if you read James and you read Bill and you read Zora and Audrey, they kind of tell you this work is kind of dying work, okay? James was like, listen, to be knowledgeable and Black in this world is to be enraged almost all the time, baby. So, just be prepared for that. And so I think about, in organizing work, I used to care so much about like making sure everybody was safe. Like I, not wanting to like necessarily offend people because it's rooted in white supremacy, all discomfort is unsafety, right? The moment you make anyone feel anything less than happy, you are a problem. It is an issue because anti-Blackness. And so I think about the hard learning lesson of literally putting your life on the line for people who want to kill you.
Oof.
It is such a wild experience to be conditioned your whole entire life to be everybody's caregiver and nobody ever have to learn the skill to care for you. And it's because it's in media, right? There's no instructions in media on how to love, care for, show up for Black fat folks. Hello? And then they'll say, okay, well, you were in some of the rom-coms. Oh, well, we were addition, we were the comedy, we were the comedic relief. The only thing society teaches people to do with fat Black folks is to use us for comedy, right? And we see this perpetuated in our relationships. When Black fat folks are going through harm, going through abuse, it's like, well, you're the bigger person because, well, whatever, or you couldn't have been the one, you like, we don't have to protect you because you got it, right? When we're talking about these ideas around safety and protection, we also have to think about like what it means for the people who are putting their literal lives on the line, and that like people don't want to care for you. And I feel like this exists in so many ways. And I know personally from the fat Black folks that I speak with, like we all have such relationship to dying, and like to land is just like the white supremacy and anti-Blackness has made Black folks have intimate relationship with death and dying. Because white supremacy says the worst thing you can do is to take your own life, because how dare you not be productive in the system we live in. And so because we internalize those things, Black folks also say, how dare you not want to live? How dare you not want to be here? How dare you be ugly and experience what that means to be constantly disposed of in this world, and then want to dispose of yourself? Because the reality of oppositional relationships is this: there is no pretty, there is no success, there is no safety without people to inflict that harm and violence on, right? And so these oppositional relationships really offer not just, sometimes I feel like it gets real heady where people just talk about like privileges and things, but I really want people to think about the practical everyday experiences of folks who are doing this work. And truly putting their, I mean, literally putting their lives on the line for people who want to kill us, who would never kiss our foreheads, who would never give us a hug, who would never offer us a home. So, yeah.
So I want to read this quote, and I know those of you, I see a lot of you that are my students and have been in spaces with me before, but I'm just going to read this quote really quickly to underscore what TJ just gave us. And this was, and then I'm going to come to Isaac and Adrian and allow them to ask their questions. But this is a quote from Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857, March 6th. So almost, anyway, we won't get into the years. Anyway, the quote says, African Americans had for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might be justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his own benefit. For his own benefit. He was bought and he was sold and he was treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. And I say that because, the law school that I teach in, where my center is based, is in Minneapolis and St. Paul, right? The Twin Cities. And just 5-10 minute drive away from campus at Lake River Minnehaha, that is where Dred Scott was held, in a free territory, within a free state, by the Union Army, rented out, right? Where slavery is illegal. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you think about what TJ just said. And then again, that last line, he was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic, wherever a profit could be made by it, right? And this idea that you are being reduced, right, to a type of status that is about pleasure and labor for life. And so when we talk about death work, what does it mean to even live when your life, and again, I will just say this very quickly because we're going to move on, that the Supreme Court has never overturned completely, explicitly, the Dred Scott decision. That's something to sit with. This case has never been overturned. And so when we talk about legal precedent, this is still legally good law. So sit with that. The Black man has no rights. They didn't say the Black man, sorry, the Negro, the race, the class, has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And they should be traded as a piece of ordinary merchandise. Okay? A tool, a technology for pleasure. So let's wake that up. But I'm going to come to you now, Isaac. Go ahead and ask your question, beloved. Come off camera so that people can look at you, and then we'll go on to Adrian.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and thank you, panel. It's been such a pleasure to hear you speak. So thank you. But I wanted to ask you more about the connection or the interconnectedness between abolition, care work, and death work. I'm thinking of care and abolition as meaning safe housing, affordable health care, deinstitutionalization, decriminalization, decommodification, and how do we move from value as a commodity to value as quality of life, particularly in Black queer life? Essentially, how can we move from Black excellence, meaning financial success?
Can you repeat that last part of your question, please?
Of course. How can we move from Black excellence, meaning financial success?
Well, I'll just throw my hat in the ring. Give it up for the lady. Sorry, I was thinking about Babs. Battle rap, my bad. But no, thank you so much for your question. And the last part I don't know if I can speak to, because like I don't know if I can fix my face to talk about Black excellence, and I don't want to do that. But like I don't even know how to interpret it. My body be saying some other stuff than my mouth do, and I just be trying to watch that. But no, but I love the whole question. So the piece around the connection around care work, death work, and abolition, I think that so much about abolition is like possibility development, and I think that that's really hard to grapple with. And I think in this time, because in movement and also working working with community, right? And then also working in nonprofit, it's really difficult because we're like in a different perspective right now around how metaphor and like dreamy language is landing. So I do want to like name like with abolition and like the interventions that are being made, I think there's a lot of work moving. So to be clear, like this one particular aspect of like a larger narrative that is moving mainstream is not to like eradicate or erase that, but to also name that like even in that, bringing folks into that particular possibility also means trying to imagine what that can look like. So then when we talk about how care work would come online, often what we're asking for with abolition is actually a world where care would be the basis, right? Like that actually our world will be based in how we define care and how we build it out together. And that we can actually move towards individualized care, but also move away from a society that literally just turns us into property and that we're only ever moving in a slave relation, right? So even in that, there's a particular type of sacrifice, and death work comes in with that, because they're, for example, not calling the police on your abuser and you leaning into an abolitionist like framework, even if you don't even mean it to be abolitionist. And I don't want to like make it seem like you can't have the politic or the praxis, like, and that's enough to just be an abolitionist. But that, I think both things are true. You can do something that's abolitionist aligned and also not be an abolitionist. So if you make a decision that is abolitionist aligned by not calling the police, because you also know the police do not make things better, will not actually affirm your victimhood, will not necessarily guarantee you safety or intervention or de-escalation, or extend you care or medical assistance, or offer you any type of funding, financing, or whatever you need to mobilize out of there if you are in an abusive situation and you need to leave that house. And then on top of that, might also possibly kill you or kill your abusive partner, right? Or the person who's abusive in your home. Even in that decision, like that is a particular type of sacrifice where you have to make a choice around your own safety. And that I would actually say is a part of death work. And it's also a particular extension of care work for yourself, right? Because you also know the threat is against you, right? It's not just against your abuser, but even in that, the way that victims are criminalized for naming their victimhood, even how we see like the retroactive charging of sexual assault victims if they feel bullied by the police when taking their statement, or if they didn't do the particular protocol that that police department requires in order to fulfill a particular sexual assault process, right? So in that regard, I think that there is a particular sacrifice that we I wouldn't say it's taking an L, but to a certain degree, we could argue that, right? Where it's like, even when we talk about like what it would mean to, if we think about like any, I can't think of the white boy's name. There's so many of them who are killers, but whenever we think about anyone who is like an anti-Black op, right, in any capacity, thinking about ending prisons and closing prisons, and that being like the first question that's asked to you, like, okay, well, what should we do about this particular killer, right? And it's like, I'm actually not clear. I mean, honestly, if it was up to me, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this because this is recorded, but if they are non-Black, it's really not a question for me. Like, you can go, gentrify heaven, you know? So like, and but I think if you're Black and we have to struggle through that, that is also a particular type of death work, because how much empathy do you have to sacrifice? How much out of your being do you have to change? How much ethic do you have to give up in order to move towards Black life and the possibility of an abolition driven future, right? How much you have to give up, right? And then thinking about how slaves navigated so much around a non-ethic, right? Like, like, was there a true desire to engage in fanticide, or was that actually something that became a result of wanting to find a way to intervene how a never-ending agony is facing your child's future, right? And so actually, I would rather take you out of this world because this world wants to kill you anyway. The unethics that we have to engage in and of itself is actually a particular type of death work. It is a sacrifice that you're trying to intervene in imminent terror, right? But you also have to engage particular decisions, particular sacrifices, and particular types of labor that is agonizing. It is a circulation of agony in your body. And so I think to that degree, even in pursuit of care, it requires significant amounts of death, whether it is other people, whether it is yourself, and whether it is people that you actually love, but there is no alternative.
Mm-hmm. So here's what I'm gonna do, because like, one, I told y'all 8:30 y'all's time, 9:30 Eastern time. And so if speakers want to drop off, I understand that y'all been paying for your time. You gotta go. So do that. It's not rude. It's a reality. It's a coin. It's the truth. But what I do want to do is do some real close, like really quick back to back. Adrian, someone else had their hand raised before our other speaker. I do want to get you in. I don't know where you went. But let me get Adrian in here to ask their questions. I want to do some just like 2, 3 questions back to back, and then we'd answer them. So where the other speaker was, pop back up. But Adrian, do your thing, do your big one, sugar. Good to see you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for this. I think Hunter actually just answered really my question that I was having is I am someone that is going into social work as far as being licensed and also being very conscious and knowing that the practice of social work is also part silly when we talk about the law of how we've situated Black life, and going into a system that knows that is generally perpetuating this, but it's also, I am someone that is also trying to disrupt it. How do we get that balance of like doing that care work in these realms of institutions and with these people that, again, intrinsically don't have that like right in the forefront and in our face want to kill us, but by means of the whiteness that they unfortunately embrace, they engage in that every day in practice. When we're trying to disrupt that, and I'm someone that is coming into the field like, hey, this is not right. If we look at the history of social work per se, and we're trying to break those things down, trying to disrupt that constantly, and then not having that affirmation with Black, brown, yellow, white, all types of people in the system that we're, again, perpetuating how we're situated in life.
So you're naming attention, but I also want to give you the opportunity to also rephrase that part as a question, because I felt like you were going somewhere, right? So where was you going, baby? What was the question in there? Because there was a lot of questions, but I want to get to the one that you wanted us to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I guess how do we find a balance for doing this care work when we're situating in systems that, again, inevitably are aimed at, I guess, situating our Black lives where they currently are, and we're trying to disrupt those things. But again, we're faced with not having that affirmation with people that look like us and the people that don't look like us, inevitably in this system of social work.
My God. So how do you affirm and how do you kind of reinstantiate this kind of notion of Black life while you're standing on a particular type of racial, ethnic, citizen-based tightrope where people are trying to blow you off the rope on all sides, yet you have a politic that says death for nobody, life for all, liberation for everybody. Okay, I'm gonna hold that because I want to bring L in, and then we're going to answer both of those questions before we come to the good therapist, the good doctor, Daniel McCrary. They, them, L, what's up? What you got? What you got to add to the question?
Yeah, thank you for staying extra time, and thank you to the panel for such a great discussion. I asked this question in the chat. I wanted to ask it here right now to Hunter. When I hear you speak of care work as death work, I hear you saying that the care places us in this position of being like captive maternals, or in a position where we might be killed ourselves by doing this type of work. And I'm interested in how that relates to Sharp's concept of wake work. And when I think about it, I don't think that she would kind of disagree with that, but she does frame it as like a positive for us, like wake work as something positive that we can do to care for each other. And so I wonder about how that fits with what you're saying here. And in that, I'm thinking about Margaret Garner, who, would have killed her own child so that she wouldn't be a slave, or that line in Black Panther where Killmonger kills himself and says, like, I'd rather be buried with my ancestors who chose jumping over the ship instead of to live under the conditions we live right now. And like connecting that to what TJ said, that like being in the state of like the conditions that we're living in are so heinous that I'd rather embrace death. And should we be thinking of death not as this like negative thing that we have to like control or be away from, but that we can use differently. Hunter, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I didn't know if I wanted to. Can I answer now?
Girl, you grown. Do your thing.
Am I grown? I am 13. But no, thank you so much, Elle, for that. But yes, I think in conversation with wake work, so I would say that, yeah, I align with Sharp's analysis around it's like this particular type of imagining, or like these interventions that affirm that we are clear and that we acknowledge our positionality like in the wake as like an ontological intervention of just like naming our being. I think for me, I don't really lean too much into not that it isn't that of an ontological argument, but more so that I'm thinking more and like not more, but like where I land is like this kind of practical intervention of just like being very clear about what is happening every day in like the intramural project of just like when you were talking to niggas and it's just like some everyday shit. This is death work. I'm not explaining to you not one more time why I do not fuck with none of this weird queerphobic, transphobic shit you got going on. Goodbye. And like, like what? I'm not trying to, and I don't want to save you. And what now? So I think that to that degree, I do think that it actually aligns exactly with what Christina Sharp says about wake work, right? Because I think it's about a hyper awareness of the positionality that we're in, and then making an intervention or a responsiveness to that, right? Like understanding the conditions so much so that you're making the intervention about what you're going to do with those conditions. And then I think to your last point, like, yeah, I do think that death can be useful. And I think I do wonder the question though about like revolutionary suicide or using death as like, I think that death has so many different interpretations of what we can do with it. So I do believe that also there's this idea that like sacrifice in and of itself for the sake of the larger collective or for Black liberation is automatically like positioned as a revolutionary intervention. And I think that that could be true, but I do wonder about what do the living social dead do with those revolutionary deaths. And I feel like there is not enough meaning made out of those deaths to use a momentum to build the world after, or to even finish the project, right? Because if we all jump and let's all jump, why are y'all, some of y'all still in a motherfucking ship? Now, are you coming in the water or no? And so the question becomes like, are we in a pact together? Is there a particular commitment that we made together? And also, does the meaning that someone tells us that their death, like, means for them or anoints for them, like, do we honor that? Because I think back to the quote from Zora Neale Hurston, I would actually argue both, right? I think that what Zora says is brilliant. And I think you could tell people your pain and they still will say that you enjoyed it. They will still make their own narrative of what you did with your life, or how you felt in your death or in your dying, or why you died. And so much of, like, because even there's a repositioning of what is considered to be revolutionary after the fact. And I think about Huey Newton making a distinction between illegitimate capitalists and political prisoners, right? Where it's like there is a line being drawn here about folks who wanted to align themselves or try to survive capitalism and ended up in prison, versus people who wanted to end capitalism altogether and now I'm in prison, right? And so what is the distinction between that? And I do understand that language can only take us so far, that even those binaries or those hard definitions, we will immediately fail the criteria the moment that we actually set them in stone. But also at the same time, I think language can carry us to the next destination. And I think that sometimes we should do that. So I think that if death is going to have meaning in that particular way, where there's like either an intention for intervening the state, or making a case for why you're dying, or making a suicidal revolutionary intervention, then I think that community needs to be behind that. I think that we need to trust what folks are doing with that revolutionary death, and we need to also support that. So much about revolutionary death is the reverberation after the fact, the community that makes meaning out of it. And we set the fires right after you jump. And if we're not doing that, then it begs the question, was it worth it for that person? Love to ask them in the afterlife. I don't know, like, want to phone them, right? And then also too, what the fuck is wrong with us that we're not listening to our folks and we're not really in the commitment that we said that we are? So yeah, those are the tensions that I'm holding. But thank you for that amazing question.
Can I say something quick to Adrian's question about balance? One of the things I feel like I'm still unlearning is balance. Is the idea that balance is a state of like permanence. And part of why I say that is because given the things that we're talking about, you know, anti-Blackness, racial capitalism, the violence that shows up in so many different ways, it's a lot going on that we who are doing whatever work we're doing are trying to fight against or mitigate, right? And these things are persistent. And so I think, while I do think that there's such a thing as like finding the pace that you want to operate at, I think for me, at least, I'm in a season of kind of unlearning balance, because I know that the work is going to be lifelong, right? And so like what it takes to sustain over a lifetime is different than what it takes to sustain over a season. And, you know, I think that, you know, I'll take that to tie into Elle's question around care work and step work, is because we have to balance, how do we not be desensitized to all of the death around us, while still holding on to the passion and the vibrance and the agitation that's bringing us to this work. But again, how do we do that for a lifetime? So the way we might do this at earlier points in our lifetime might not be the same as what we do as we age, right? But we have to hold those tensions and understand that like the temporality that we're dealing with is like is not finite and is not predictable. So, you know, this is not to say do not take care of yourself, do not give yourself the things that you need, but also recognize that depending on the types of work you specifically are all going to do, like what balance is may not fit into a 40-hour work week, right? It may not fit into a perfect schedule, right? But at different times might require different things.
You know, I think that's real. And I want to read this quote, and then I also want to come to Daniel, because I know there's something to say. But Daniel, I don't know if you mind if Tarhan asks their question before you give a summation. Do you mind?
No, I would really love to hear Tarhan's question.
Okay, so I just want to read this quote. Also, y'all, shout out to my RA, Isaac. This is why they're my research assistant, because they be finding the quotes like this and they be reading closely. But they found this quote from Christina Schartz in The Wake on Blackness and Being, and it says, "Wake work is hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying, to ease their way, and also to the needs of the living," right? So let me one more time. Like, great work is hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying, to ease their way, and also to the needs of the living. So in many ways, right, like death wake work is a kind of doula methodology of death work. Okay. Like, how do we get you to death in a way, right, that is less harmful, less violent, and also does not undignify the ways in which you lived on this earth? Because one of the things that she says in that book, and it's a heartening back to Zong, shout out to Zong, and says, wait a minute, how do we defend the dead and the dying and the yet living and almost dying, right? And that's the work. And who among us is the yet living and almost dying? The unhoused, those without quality health care, or as Sadia Hartman says, skewed life chances, the afterlives of slavery, whose bodies and psyches it is being visited upon. So I want us to really think more critically about both what Hunter and TJ are asking us to think about is this idea of death work, but also what Christina is talking about as a type of wake work, right? And Sadia's renaming as the situation of it all is the afterlives of slavery, right? And then Demar is telling us, wait a minute, how do you intervene? What are the policy violences, right? We have to think about what does policy as violence look like? How do we start naming policy itself as violence? Not just physical violence, not just sexual violence, but economic violence, political violence, right? Policy violence, ontological violence, right? The ways in which even these laws are constructed and deconstruct Black people out of being humans in the law as violence, right? Imaginary violence, erasure, right? So we have to get into all of that if we're going to be very serious about contending with the afterlives of slavery, contending with death work, contending with wake work, right? Because if not, we're gaslighting ourselves. If you're not serious and you're not rigorous about the source of discontent, right? The source and the power of violence itself, the power of violations. Let's talk about the etymology of the word violence. We're talking about a violation, a crossing of a boundary that was not consensual. But what happens when the body itself is not allowed to consent? Come on, somebody. We got to get into it because that's what we're talking about when the Black body itself is not seen as human or citizen. It has no power or privilege to consent.
Period.
So what more will we demand? How will we demand it? And will we demand it on the terms of law itself? Or is there a difference, as critical race theory and Derek Bell try to tell us to say with English convergence, is there a different terrain that is less unholy for you to claim your being outside of law, outside of the laws of slavery, outside of the laws of raciality? But I'm gonna shut the hell up and move on to Turhan so we can get on to Daniel and the people with the last word. Turhan, go ahead and ask your question, beloved.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for doing this. Thank you all for being here. Lovely people, really generative. I really appreciate it. I had a question about something Daniel woke up earlier about the idea of safety and security being inherently, like in our system, exclusive, like excluding us, built in, that framework being something that we have to imagine ourselves out of, because those ideas, at least as we understand them, as the law understands them, don't include us. And so I'm thinking about that we, and in terms of what we have to imagine and the formation of that we. And so my question is, and this can be for whomever, but how do we arrive at a rubric of expectation, for the people that for other Black people and people that we ask in the formation of that we, in order to set those standards and the ideals of what that new safety and what that reimagining looks like?
All right, and then so first we'll open up with Daniel, and then I'll swing it back to the rest of the people. And for our panelists, if you don't mind, I know some of us have different things going on and different reasons, but if you want people to be able to contact you or connect with you, put whatever contact information or none at all, social media or none at all, that you feel is useful in the chat, so the girls can buy your work, connect with you, see your talks, read your readings, buy your paintings, get your services, honey. All of that. Go ahead, Daniel.
So, love the question. I want to read something. And, or I want to read some descriptors.
Mm-hmm.
Sorrow, anxiety, grief, burdens of mind, serious mental attention, concern, anxiety, anxiety caused by apprehension of evil or the weight of many burdens, sorrow, wailing, lamenting, sorrow, and trouble. And these are the etymologies of the word care. I think that in the modern day, care has a really kind of saccharine veneer that makes invisible this very deep historical meaning of what it means to care. Specifically, when I read this, I'm thinking about burdens of the mind and serious mental attention. I'm also thinking about how it says grief, which almost argues that death work is primordial and care work comes after. And that in order to imagine something beyond safety and security, we have to honor that that means we're going to have to engage in deep, serious mental attention about what the hell we're up against. I think sometimes it's so painful, we're thinking, I'd like a solution that's quick, but this is also, like Demar said, this is a lifelong project. And when we think about who's living and who's dying, sometimes that means it may not get any better for me, but I'm going to keep working for the lineage at large, rather than only thinking about what's going to happen for me in my lifetime. And, if I'm going to be very psychotherapeutic for a moment, or maybe no, not that, I'll go with the meme. Care work, death work. Okay, they were sisters, maybe even identical twin sisters. That's all.
You see how they dropped the mic so softly like that? They said maybe they were sisters, honey. Maybe it was Celie and Nettie, girl. I don't know. But I love that phrase. The same blood, but different dialectical and embodied experiences. Come on, TJ, and then we'll let the people bring us on home. So
I know
after
that's right.
TJ, we'll
Hallelujah.
circle back to the girls and give our goodbyes.
He's coming in a Honda.
The Holy Ghost, my God.
I wanted to just mention, like, okay, what I'm about to say is like it's gonna be a little bit on the darker side, you know what I'm saying? And that's where I be. But I just want to really wake up that if under white supremacy, we acknowledge that most, if not all, Black bodies will be used to perpetuate white supremacy, and that therefore we will be subjugated, by white supremacy, can we just even philosophically consider that Black folks wanting to live in the ways that white supremacy defines living is an anti-Black project? And so, like, what does it look like to really honor Black people who want to die? Like, as a, like, I'm about to be up out of here, I can't do it, but before I go, in the words of Hunter, I'm a rat-ta-ta-ta, you know, it's like, before I go, you know, before I let you, you know what I'm saying? And I think about, I'm gonna bring a little bit, you know, I'm getting into anime now, y'all. But there's this anime called Hunter x Hunter, not too much. And there's this character named Welfin, and he's fighting this octopus, okay? And the octopus is just straight, it's scary. The octopus is scary as fuck. The octopus is like, I can't do this, I can't fight you. But then the octopus says, I will die before I let you use me as an agent against the people who I care about. And the octopus then is no longer afraid to die. He's like, kill me then. Kill me, because that's the most powerful thing you can do, you know, outside of trying to use me. And so Welfin ends up losing, okay? And he's like, this quote really stuck out to me. This is season 5, episode 123, not too much. Welfin says, I never knew how hard it would be to fight someone who had no regard for their life. And I think about what it would mean for Black folks, not on some like everybody let's drink the Kool-Aid type shit, but on some, before I let white supremacy use me as an agent against my people, I'm gonna put my life on all of us. We really all gotta fight together. And just how much life we would have if we weren't so afraid of dying. Baby, the worst is already happening. You're already dying, right? Anti-Blackness is already killing you. Anti-Blackness already predicated where you can grow up. Anti-Blackness already tested your little cousins on what prisons are gonna be built because they didn't test well enough, right? All of the worst things are already happening. What is so scary, truly, about saying, yeah, before I go, I'm about to be used for some quote unquote, and I know we talking about in the chat, revolutionary being, you know, there is some woo-wop the bam about the word revolutionary, but just some anti-white supremacist, anti-capitalism. I mean, many folks couldn't even put now, I'm just gonna say, many people couldn't even just stop going to Starbucks. Many people can't even stop going to, you know, institutions, right? Who they know want to kill them, who will never hire somebody to be the CEO, who will never have a diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know what I'm saying? Like, you are already invested in your death, baby. Why not fight on your way out? What truly will you lose? And so, yeah, I just wanted to wake that up. Oh, and lastly, I wanted to say that for people who are feeling like, oh, this sounds like really dope, but it also sounds like very scary to really honor what's being said, to really like hold the things. It's like, you are not quote unquote crazy, right? You are responding sanely to insane circumstances, right? Your body is responding in the best way that it can to truly perpetual gratuitous violence. And so just give yourself some grace in that. And yeah, just really grateful to have been able to speak with folks, but that was some of the last things I want to say.
Yeah, thank you for that, TJ. Before we move on to Hunter and Demar, and maybe, you know, one more time, shout out to the good doctor, Daniel. But I do want to note that, like, you know, so much that we think about to be revolutionary, we think about it to be forward facing, we think about it to be futuristic. But I'll remind you all of the old Negro spiritual that said, before I be a slave, I'll be dead in my grave. Okay. And so right now we think about we think about like kind of, you know, our Black activism and our anti-racist activism across race and gender and sexuality, and our anti, you know, cis heterosexist activism. And we think about it as like, what are things that we lose, right? But our ancestor said, before I be a slave, I'll be dead in my grave. And what was the gospel corollary? And they said, we'll understand it better by and by.
Preach that word. Come on. But also one thing I've really been thinking about, I'm so sorry, I'm really about to shut up.
Go ahead, go
One thing
ahead,
I've
go
really
ahead.
been thinking about is like, I know this sounds wild, but I've been thinking about the Underground Railroad. And I think about how there were more radical white people back then than Black people are radical now. Because some Black folks within community, I know I'm talking about how hard it is to find Black folks in a community, at least in my experience, who will actually do the labor and work of caring for people who look like me. I know it sounds wild. I know, hold me through it. I know. But I'm just thinking about, because I think about how it wasn't hella, like I'm not saying it's thousands upon thousands, but I do think about the white folks who literally risked their life in their own family to try to get Black folks to freedom. And I think about Black folks' access now and just like how much anti-Blackness I experience from my folks. You know what I'm saying? And like, and as a houseless person, yeah, it's a whirlwind to witness Black folks with access not want to care and show up for Black folks who are struggling, even when you have put your life on the line, right? Yes, so that's just one thing that I'm thinking about and considering.
I mean, I think that's something we need to sit with and also meditate on. And I hate to speed by it because we are 27 minutes past time. And I don't believe in Black people working for free. Y'all know how I feel about this. So I'm gonna give y'all the opportunity, starting with the good Dr. McCrary, to give some final thoughts and some goodbyes. Of course, you're welcome to stay longer if you want to give more input on the free, but you already 27 minutes over. And as Maya Angelou said, I am the hope of the slave. I don't work for free. Amen. Amen. So Daniel, then Hunter, and then Demar for our last words, my
We're
God.
wrapping up. We're wrapping it up now.
Yes, yes, we're doing our obligatory wrap it up. If the
Or
people want to
legally,
stay
we
for
are
African
closing,
Americans after dark,
closing arguments.
people are welcome to do that for however long we decide to stay and endeavor, you know.
I think what I'm closing with is a line from the etymology about that deep mental attention. I'm encouraging people to be okay with wrestling with what you've heard tonight for as long as it takes. It doesn't need to make sense quickly. It's actually, oh, in some ways, it's ideal to just let it simmer. I think we're in a moment where it might be controversial to quote Nicki Minaj, but let it soak in like seasoning. Okay, let it take its time. Let it run its course, and that's okay. Not someone say it really, but that's okay, and because that's a part of the lifelong work. Um, and I think also the other thing that I would say is to encourage people to look up the definition of care and death and go to the etymologies and really dig into those and wrestle with those two and just see what that means to you and what comes up for you as you continue to look at those words and the history of those words and how they're used today and how those things have changed.
Very well, very well. Thank you so much. Uh, Hunter, Hunty, the lion, honey, the king and the queen of the jungle, if you will.
Good
Yeah.
for me. My Leo stellium is just shining right now. Thank you. I want to say thank y'all to all panelists. Thank you, Dr. Anansi Wilson, for putting this beautiful panel together and for the beautiful foresight and scholarship that really framed this. And just your beautiful light. We're very grateful. Thank you to everyone who came. And yeah, my final thoughts are this. I loved the I believe it was Cicely's comments in the chat. I really loved their commentary a lot about the pieces around revolution and resistance. And I think that I just wanted to name as we grapple with like the overlaps of like care work and death work and and really like all of our abolitionist dreams. And I believe that all of us are committed to a particular practice if we're here tonight. But also being Black and what that means, right? Like, I mean, like after, we close out of the Zoom, we still got to be niggas who got to try to get through the night, right? And yeah, just thinking about how I think revolution has such a moving definition and embodiment. And I think that it's a really dangerous game. Like, because I think that it's really hard to stabilize and invite people into like a particular ethos that doesn't have a concrete foundation all the time about what it looks like, how it comes online, right? We can talk about the praxis that frames it, but how it happens, right? And I think that like that's constantly what we've been kind of grappling with is like this metaphorical, dreamy intervention and often the concrete that like becomes a very strange and common collision. And so I think in that, like, because thinking about the mitigation piece, this is why I do think that it's like if the world isn't going to end, because a lot of the work that it would actually require to end the world would actually lean on care workers, in a particular way that I actually think that we don't revere care workers enough in our community to begin with, to even get close enough to even think of the possibility of ending this world. And I think that if we're not there yet, not that we could never be, but if we're not there yet, and if we are just kind of in this constant state where anti-Blackness is not moving, right? And that all we can do is kind of be the EMTs to anti-Blackness. We can be on the scene, but it's going to be another collision in a couple minutes. And it's going to be on another highway that we're not going to be able to get to. And so-and-so don't got a car and they can't drive, right? And so even in that, I think that I do want to hold the tension that sometimes even like the line that we want to hold around revolution, sometimes isn't always, and this is just from my purview, this isn't for anybody else, right? But like, I just don't think it always holds the tension of what is actually required to make those things happen. I think that like when I think about revolution happening, I know exactly what it looks like in my head. I know exactly what I think that we should do to get there and what like we can do this, right? Like, and it's like, yeah, we're probably gonna die, or we're going to prison, right? And it's like, let's go. But I don't think that there's enough niggas to make meaning out of it, right? Because I could say like I got my niggas who are going to jump in the car with me, but it's like I don't know where the meaning would go. And I feel like that's the fear, right? Where it's like I think maybe that's also a part of it, is that when you sacrifice for the larger revolution under the premise that you're doing a revolutionary resistance work, that like you also have to just trust that maybe one day, even if it's not immediate, that it will build up into a particular momentum that will lead to the inevitable fall, right, of an oppressive system. And I don't know if like, and I don't know if that's something that we need to accept as people who might want to engage in some particular type of revolutionary suicide or things that require a particular sacrifice where we might end up dead, or in prison at the end of it. But yeah, I think in holding that, I'm often thinking about what the ecosystem is that we live in and how many people will try to find latitude in our sacrifice to go build neoliberal dreams after, right? The people who are going to make the GoFundMes who have never met me in life, because I died and they said that they knew me one day on Twitter and like, just, send $5,000, it's for the funeral. Hello? And also, I'm not mad if they get your money. I mean, I don't think that you should be exploiting anybody's death, but I also feel like if you're in a position where you feel like you need to exploit somebody's death, I think we need to be asking a lot of questions about what people's needs are and how they're not being met enough, where people have to throw out an ethic in these moments. And that's often that ambulance chasing ass behavior that people are positioned in, because it's not just about trying to find purpose in life, which is also a result of anti-Blackness, but it is often always an opportunity to try to find resources that are denied to you in the daily quotidian, right? Because if you're poor in the regular day-to-day, it doesn't matter. But if you're poor at the perfect time, perfect storm, perfect death that has just enough spectacle, like you might actually eat today. Right. And is that okay? That's fucked the fuck up, right? But Black death constantly moves the goalpost for all of us, right? Around how we have to engage a particular radical ethic in order to intervene that death never happening again and to honor those who are killed and taken from us. And then the other part is thinking about how many people see those moments and whether they want to or not, whether there's unscrupulous behavior or not, because I don't know what it means to be unscrupulous and anti-Black to be Black, But like, I think also too, like looking at those moments and thinking, damn, how many needs are going unmet and why we have to wait for spectacle to happen to find ways to get those needs met, which then begs the question, can revolution ever happen if so many niggas are hungry, right? And like a stimulus check during a Trump presidency is enough to sometimes get the people going. And it's like, but like, but get your money, but also y'all don't want to, and I don't even know where to take y'all, right? Because it's like, I actually can't feed you and I can't stop you from getting the money, but can I invite you into a politic in this moment where you're getting a need met that you haven't been getting met? I don't know. Those are all the conundrums that we're in. So to be clear, that is not an affirmation of these like very hurtful and harmful behaviors, but it's actually more so an indictment of the ecosystem that puts into collision what, when and where revolution can happen and what it requires and who needs to be participatory in it to make death meaningful in those revolutionary resistances. And it takes everybody else after the fact to make the reverberation happen, to make the earthquake and to make something shake. So that was my rap.
No, I love that rap. Come on, give me the Megan Thee Stallion in the end, period. But I know you're a Nicki girl, so we're here for that too. But I will say this, like I think it's really important. Like I feel like, and it's hard to boil down what you said because you said so many different things and so many brilliant things. But what I'm getting from what you just said is the need for Black people to confiscate life, right? And what does it mean to need to confiscate life, to confiscate value, to confiscate being, to confiscate food, right? Uh, and can you be indicted for the necessity of needing to confiscate a category that buttresses your death, right? Is there justice in that? It may be unlawful, but is it just? Right? To say that, like, okay, Black people are doing this thing, right? They're responding to a particular type of policy violence with physical violence. They're responding to a particular type of policy violence with economic violence. But what they're really doing is stealing life. So they might live a little bit more, right? Then they might live again because the importance of like the Constitution and this idea of common law and these kind of inheritable rights is the idea that whiteness itself is baked into the law as a reproductive, generative right in of itself. That's what precedent is. And Blackness in of itself is an inheritable debt for Black people. And so does it mean to confiscate life? And shouldn't you? Maybe. I don't know. I don't got the answer. But what I do know is that like there is no life in North America without Black bloodletting. And so if the key ingredient to life is my blood or rape or reproductive organs, whether it be a vagina or a penis, right? Because we both know that rape happens both ways in slavery. It's the forced reproduction of children in many ways, like men being forced to have sex with women they're not attracted to or are not friends or not dating or whatever, right? And also women being forced to be something these particular type of things. And then people with no gender being forced to do what the fuck ever. Right? That is serviceable to the economic structure. So, like, how do we sit with that? And how do we kind of underscore and understand that all of these violence are actually about the theft of life? So, how do you live but there's still more life back? And is it theft if it's your own life? Is it theft if it's a recuperation? How do we sit with that? I don't know. But anyway, Dr. Lewis, come on, what you got for us with your closing words?
One of the most beautiful things about tonight is every time I'm following my fellow panelists, like I'm just blown away. So, first and foremost, I want to say thank you again, Dr. Wilson, for having us tonight. I think a lot's been said. I'm going to leave with two very quick things. And I think one, I'll uplift what Dr. McCrary is saying is, let the things that you've heard tonight simmer. Because you're going to be sitting with these things for the rest of your life, whether you're conscious of them or not. Things that have been said tonight will manifest and unfold forever. And that's okay. I think, as an extension of that, some people may find it hard to then know, like, well, what do I do now? Like, how do I take this and mobilize it? And, one thing I try to always remember or try to think about consciously is, what can I do with the time I have today? I think back to something Hunter said. Hunter, I think it was either when we first started or when we all just got on and you are awake, you are here, right? And it's like, right? But it's like, because some days we may not have it. Some days we may not have our best of everything, right? So it's thinking, what can I do with the time I have today? And maybe for some folks, that's showing up here tonight. Maybe, that looks something different tomorrow, right? But no, I just want to, one, say that. And two, I think I just want to end with, there will be Black people in the future. Even in spite of all that exists, even in spite of all that works against us and works to mitigate and eliminate Black life, there will be Black people in the future. So continue to, find ways to think critically about issues that have been raised, but also know that the fight there's going to be opportunities to keep the fight going. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. TJ, did you have another word to give us? I know I gave you not really a forewarning before you spoke last time. That'd be a final word. So I just want to give you a quick second before we close out.
I just want to express gratitude for all the panelists. And I also want to thank the folks who are here who may not have got a chance to speak, who really wanted to, but couldn't. Your energy is felt. Sending much love to everybody in this space. I did put my contact information in the chat. And I know we are talking about, tough things. I'm a peer support counselor. So if you are looking for somebody to help you process through system harm and how it impacts your everyday life, I'm available. I don't know if my baby Daniel was taking clients or not, but yes, I just want to thank everybody. And yeah, in another time I sing something, but it's late, I'm sleepy. But yes, just thankful for you having me too, Dr. Anansi. Thank you so much. And Hunter, thank you for the laughs, the energy sharing, please. Just yes, much love to everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just say to close out, it's been so beautiful. I'm so glad that each of you, you took time out of your schedule. All of you are people that have your own practices and your own genres, and you're very, very busy. And you give a lot of emotional labor, both in your work that you do for your career, but also the work in the ways that you show up in Black and Black queer communities. So it was very important to me that we were able to find a date that we could all agree upon and a time. And now that you've stayed 45 minutes over, I feel like I'm being anti-Black for allowing that even to happen. I try to keep the trains running on time, sweetie. Even now, people are trying to enter the room, honey. I don't even know what's going on. But it's 10:14 Eastern. But I do want to say that, I'm going to stop the recording soon. So folks can leave, but also maybe I'll stay 40 minutes later so people can ask questions they want to ask on camera. But the recording piece will be available both on YouTube and the center's website. So thank you all, because it's an important word. And I will say save the date for August 9th for the event we'll have with Christina Sharp, honoring their work in the wake on Blackness and Being, but also Ordinary Notes and the effects that it's had and should possibly have going into the future, and not should definitely have going into the future, on the ways in which we interrogate Black life and the law. So shout out to that. And stopping the recording now. So thank you all for coming, and we will see you all soon. Get your